Leading global economists are predicting Russia's collapse in 2025. All of last year, Putinomics, rattling along with its bloated military-industrial complex, was rolling downhill. And now, finally, it has almost reached rock bottom. Most likely, even that bottom will be broken through.
The coming year looks very alarming and concerning because significant money problems are starting to appear. Notice that by the end of the year, we reached a rather unpleasant and difficult situation where the central bank was ultimately forced to come to the budget's rescue. The Russian law on the central bank prohibits the central bank from directly lending to the government or supporting the budget. We reached a point where the financial situation is so bad that the central bank is practically starting to lend to the budget of the Russian Federation. Otherwise, the budget doesn't balance. Otherwise, it won't be able to finance expenditures.
Looking at the deranged cigarette butt, who clearly has no intention of stopping the war or engaging in any reasonable negotiations, the West decided to tighten sanctions as much as possible. More precisely, to ensure that the sanctions already imposed actually start working. The main blow will be dealt to the shadow tanker fleet of the Russian Reich.
U.S. President Joe Biden plans to significantly increase sanctions pressure on Moscow in order to give Donald Trump's administration more leverage in negotiations with the Kremlin to end Russia's war against Ukraine.
The essence of the sanctions will be to specifically target, in particular, the shadow fleet of international vessels transporting Russian oil.
If the Kremlin is unable to trade oil, the war will end with crowds of hungry pensioners and one-legged special military operation veterans taking Moscow in 3 days.
Another wave of panic attacks and hysteria hit us yesterday.
They brought me to the hospital, but I didn't get any help. They cut off my leg, didn't sew it up. Now they've actually thrown me out of the hospital.
Unfortunately, the so-called shadow fleet is currently, at this very moment, actively helping Russia to circumvent oil restrictions and, in the process, earn extraordinary profits. As a result, Putin can not only produce more weapons than all of Europe, but also pay astronomical sums to disposable mercenaries who survive on the front for 10 days, and for each casualty, more than 10 million rubles are paid out. A calculator could overheat from numbers like these.
In Krasnoyarsk Krai, they didn't hesitate to place contract service advertisements in schools. In the suburb of Krasnoyarsk, in Solonsy, a poster urging people to sign a contract was stuck onto a school fence. And in Krasnoyarsk itself, at school no. 45, they put the same poster up on a classroom board.
Washington has decided that this madness needs to end. They're now planning to actively launch a real and determined hunt for Russian oil tankers, as well as for those international foreign companies that buy this oil.
Hello? That's it. There will be no movie.
Apparently, Trump has decided to strengthen his negotiating position. In the US, they remember very well how the mighty and unbreakable Soviet Union was brought down. They crashed oil prices, and the socialist paradise crumbled like a cookie in hot tea.
In 1986, commodity prices collapsed. There was a glut of black gold on the market. A barrel was selling for just $10 back then, and the Soviet economy simply couldn't withstand such losses.
At 7:32 p.m., the official Soviet flag was lowered over Gorbachev's residence in the Senate building of the Kremlin.
By the way, at that time, America was also led by a showman, President Ronald Reagan.
Coincidence or not? I don't think so.
Here's a joke about 3 dogs: an American dog, a Polish dog, and a Russian dog. They meet, and the American dog carefully explains in detail how things are in her country. She says, "You know, you bark. And if you bark long enough, someone will come and give you meat." The Polish dog asks, "What is meat?" And the Russian dog asks, "What does it mean to bark?"
In Moscow, people didn't laugh at the idea a former actor could become president.
So Reagan builds his campaign on the call to fight communists, on opposing the Soviet Union. In August of 1984, when international tensions were still incredibly high, before one of his speeches, he took the microphone and, not knowing the broadcast was already live, said, "My fellow Americans, I am pleased to tell you today that I have signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes."
The recipe for destroying fascist Russia is very simple, because Russia's economy is absurdly simple. They sell oil and use that money to produce weapons. If you remove oil from this equation, The war will quickly end, and the Hitler-like regime from the back alley will fall.
Stagnation. I want to be on duty.
Petrodollars cover a third of Russia's entire budget, 30%. And in 2025, spending on the army and security forces will reach a record 40%. If you subtract the expenses for the police and security services, it turns out that the oil revenues are just barely enough to cover the armed forces of the occupiers. It has increased. It has increased. Here,
taxes have gone up.
I thought you might want to know that the fuel level has now dropped to 4 feet.
If it's all so simple, then why hasn't the West cut off Putin's oxygen yet? Because up to a certain point, Russian oil was beneficial for everyone. For China, which buys it at a discount, and for America, because the surplus of oil on the market keeps prices from rising. It's just business, nothing personal. But now, there are two important factors that will sink Russia's shadow fleet. With his unreasonable demands, Putin has essentially sent Trump and his peace initiatives packing. And for Donald, that's a personal insult.
Trump stated that he would strike Moscow with missiles. He said this in an interview with the editors of the Wall Street Journal. He directly addresses Putin and says that if he doesn't back off from Ukraine, he'll get a missile in the face.
The second factor is the security of the entire world ocean. Everyone knew that Russia was buying old decommissioned ships for its shadow fleet, since, due to sanctions, it's impossible to officially purchase a vessel. Since 2022, the prices for second-hand tankers have risen by almost 100%. An old tub that, before the full-scale invasion and sanctions, cost $47 million, now has a price tag of $80 million. Demand drives the price. I think it's no mystery who's buying them up en masse.
Absolutely, 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 absolutely.
The global community turned a blind eye to the condition of these ships for the sake of green bills. But after the catastrophe in the Black Sea, ignoring the problem became a crime. In the temporarily occupied Kerch Strait, 2 Russian fuel oil tankers literally fell apart. They fell apart from old age and poor maintenance. As a result, thousands of tons of black sludge spilled into the sea.
Here you can clearly see for yourself the scale of the tragedy. It's already turning into a layered cake.
The oil slick covered the coast of Krasnodar Krai, Crimea, and the Sea of Azov.
Fuel oil reached Crimea's waters. Oil stains appeared not only on Anapa's beaches, but also along the Black Sea coast of the peninsula. Guys, now we have fuel oil in Balalaika Bay to a slick, about 1.5 by 1.5 meters, right in the middle of the bay at the entrance.
The Kremlin, of course, is trying to hide the scale of the disaster, which is already being compared to Chernobyl in terms of its impact on nature.
It's hot. The fuel oil has melted. The foam is starting to advance. People keep working, the equipment keeps moving. The bags are starting to leak little by little.
And it's not just chunks of oil-soaked sand, they're also removing the bodies of endangered animals from the Black Sea coast.
Moscow has proven unable to deal with the aftermath of the accident. They lack the money, the manpower, and the expertise. And most importantly, there is no desire to do anything. If they don't care about sending thousands of people to die in meat grinder assaults, then they certainly don't care about the sea's flora and fauna.
But we really do not care at all. But we really do not care at all.
Local residents are begging for help, while the Kremlin just spits on them from the Spasskaya Tower. The catastrophe in the Black Sea isn't even being mentioned.
Who created it? Anyway, Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich.
Now imagine that there are hundreds of such old, rusty, decommissioned tankers overloaded with oil sailing across the world's oceans. Floating dirty bombs. On top of the terrible condition of the ships, there's a deadly bonus. The entire Shadow Fleet operates in radio silence with their transponders turned off, so it's impossible to track these vessels. Other ships and the Coast Guard literally can't see them. In other words, Russia is transporting millions of tons of oil as if it were the 19th century.
Captain,
catastrophe with these tankers is sky high. No one knows where or when an accident will happen, in Rotterdam or Singapore. But everyone knows that it definitely will happen. And Moscow will just play dumb, saying the ships are under a black flag and have nothing to do with them. And even if they do admit fault, they won't be able to deal with the consequences. They can't even clean up fuel oil from the beach in Anapa. And now, when the oil crisis has hit home, the world has started to react. Russia is deliberately putting the planet at risk. They're willing to destroy the world's oceans just to destroy Ukraine.
You're a freak, an absolute freak. A real one, truly.
If Russia is deprived of oil trade, it will stop the war in Ukraine and save the Earth from catastrophe. What else is there to think about? We don't understand. We hope the decision has been made. And for Russians who aren't particularly interested in politics, it's probably a good time to start stocking up on plenty of frozen chicken legs for the upcoming new year, which, as you may have heard, will now be referred to as Trump legs.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.